This is a production of Cornell University.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I thought it would be interesting to give an update on the Adapt-N technology and specifically how integration with other software platforms is really critical if you want to bring this kind of technology to the farming community. Before I do, I want to introduce this gentleman here. He's Professor Rafael Otto. He's been here for a few weeks now, but I hadn't had a chance to introduce him. He's a professor at the of soil science at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and so he's interested in this particular topic in improving nitrogen recommendations. So with that, so Kevin will do the second part remotely. He is in Minnesota right now, but we thought it would be a great way to kind of talk about the opportunities around this kind of integration. Okay, so a quick overview. So Adapt-N it has a bit of a history coming out of Cornell, out of my program. Very much a team effort, and we rolled it out in 2008, which is already 16 years ago. And then in 2013, we decided that it wasn't good to remain in the public space. And so we decided to license it to a startup company. And then we continued working on it, and it became a cloud-based solution. And we did a lot of on-farm validation of the technology. Then in 2017 was a great year for us. The startup company was acquired by Yara International, which is a big global crop nutrition company. It's a Norwegian company. They're in like 160 countries or so. We won a big international prize around the same time. I think they were only a month apart, so it was a very nice time. Working also on API integration, so integration with other software systems. And then earlier this year, Yara sold the Adapt-N technology to Ever.Ag, which is really a sort of digital agriculture platform. And so they have field management software, but also livestock related, I believe, insurance and financing. So they're a very big player in the digital agriculture space. Just quickly, I'm not going to go into details, but this has very much been a multiple team efforts here at Cornell University, as well as when it went commercial. Some very talented entrepreneurs, software engineers, marketing people, and all of that. And we also worked with many farmers, consultants, and in New York, in Iowa, in North Carolina, many other places, to validate and test and refine the system. Okay, so why Adapt-N? So nitrogen is by far the most problematic of the crop nutrients, I would say. That's not an overstatement, I don't think. From the sort of farmer perspective, it's costly. The use efficiency tends to be relatively low because there's a lot of losses, and there's a lot of uncertainty around it, especially as it relates to weather, and by that association also, a high sensitivity to climate change, especially extreme events. From an environmental perspective, 5 major concerns: big energy input into cropping systems, nitrous oxide, of course, the big greenhouse gas concern, groundwater nitrate levels, as well as the hypoxia and anoxia concerns in estuaries, the dead zones, and then particulate formation from ammonia volatilization. So a lot of concerns there. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth. So when we think about the inputs into the system, into a field, you might say, we have kind of 2 major inputs. One is through the biological pathway, mostly legumes or maybe some free-living bacteria. Of course, the synthetic industrial process, Haber-Bosch, notably takes a lot of energy. Berkelland Ada, by the way, is an older technology that was developed by Yara, at the time Norsk Hydro, that now is gaining some interest because of the interest in green ammonia, using renewable energy. And then, of course, a lot of, there's a lot of cycling of this organic nitrogen through the soil organic matter or inputs or residues or things like that. So you have all these different sources of nitrogen that you have to deal with. And then you have a fairly complicated nitrogen cycle. And I won't go into details, but you have all these inputs that I mentioned. And most of the transformations that happen in the soil are microbially mediated. So that means that they're impacted by the environment, the temperature, water, but also crop management practices and all of those kind of things. Most nitrogen in aerobic environments ends up in the nitrate form and thereby is then subject to losses. So either leaching losses or denitrification losses, both being obviously very problematic. And then these transformations and the associated crop N availability can change dramatically in very short periods of time, especially if you get a lot of rainfall. So that's a challenge. A little bit about the hypoxia zone, because that's very relevant in when you are dealing with nitrogen, especially in corn production systems. You're probably most of you are familiar with that, especially in the Mississippi River Basin, the large so-called dead zone that develops typically in the mid to late summer. And this past year, this is an updated graph. The dead zone was again about the size of the state of New Jersey, very large area where basically most of the fish are being killed because of a lack of oxygen. And this is the, I should say, this is the level of the hypoxia task force goal, which is less than 1,900 square miles. And they have not been able to reach that for quite a while. So a lot of money being poured into it, but relatively few results. The hypoxia task force is pushing the states to reduce their nitrogen losses and reduce them by 45%. That's what these two states, they're big corn states, of course, what their goals are. Long-term 45% with no timeline, which is very convenient. But for 2025, they said minus 15%, which, as far as I know, has not been reached. I don't think that they've tried that hard, quite frankly. The greenhouse gas emissions, so nitrous oxide is about 18% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So a little less than, let's say, 1/5. I think what's notable is how little attention it gets. And most of the attention goes to carbon dioxide and, of course, methane. For U.S. ag, it's a little over 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with nitrous oxide, and that's more than the methane. By the way, doesn't this look like a presidential polling result of the past few days, especially with the red and the blue and all of that, but it's not. But it seems kind of topical. But anyway, so pretty significant, right? And very little attention being paid to it. For New York, sorry, you can't see that it has a little thing here with that's a zoom thing. It's about 1/3 is nitrous oxide. We have a lot more livestock, especially dairy industry in New York. So methane is a bigger deal. I think the nitrous oxide estimates are a little low for New York, but New York is all in on the methane. It's millions of dollars are going to that. Very little, as far as I know, on the nitrous oxide issue. Okay, so in order to understand why it's difficult to affect change with farmers on nitrogen, we need to understand the risk. So farmers are inherently risk managers. You got to have nerves of steel to be a farmer these days. So if we have here an economic optimum N rate, that's the perfectly right nitrogen rate for a particular crop in a particular field. And think corn, because that's our focus here. So risk is probability times cost. And we have this asymmetric risk for the farmer. That is, if they under-fertilize, because there's uncertainty around this EONR, if they under-fertilize, it's a lot more costly to them than if they over-fertilize, because they lose yield. And especially when the grain prices are high, which they were a few years ago, they don't want to lose yield. They can't afford that. If you over fertilize, you wasted money on fertilizer. Okay, but that's much less costly. That's a much lower risk, right? So the farmer has an incentive to always make sure that there's enough nitrogen. That means that they tend to apply excess nitrogen. And that's just realistic. That's just risk management on their part. But from a societal perspective, it's kind of the opposite in that we like to see farmers apply less nitrogen fertilizer and not over fertilize, because then you see a lot of losses. Some of our work, some of the work that was done at Michigan State, where we've been able to demonstrate once you exceed the plant uptake, you obviously have a lot more losses, right? So this is kind of opposing interests, right? So what's the solution to that? Well, from our perspective, the solution is to get this uncertainty down to very minimal so that we can estimate what is the proper nitrogen rate for your crop in any particular field, in any particular year, in any particular location, okay? So the industry, let me get rid of that okay here. The industry response to that has been the 4 R's of nutrient management. So right source, right rate, right time, right place. That's what they're promoting, right? Great concept, but the problem is what's right. How do you define what's right? Okay, and especially when it comes to rate, the problem is that the rate is the right rate is defined by the other 3 R's: source, time, place, as well as weather and many other factors. Okay, so it's a complicated issue. Just to illustrate that, this is data from Iowa State University that shows the economic optimum N rate from many nitrogen response trials over a number of years and many locations. That shows quite a distribution, right? So one could ask the question, well, what's the correct nitrogen rate, right? It's very, very difficult to decide that. It can be from 50 to 250. This is corn after soybean, right? So you can throw up your hands and say, well, is there maybe something underlying that causes this variability? Now, the ISU recommendation is this one here, around 150. So that would mean that in about 1/3 of the cases, you would under-fertilize, and in about 2/3 of the cases, you would over-fertilize. Okay, so obviously having a very generalized recommendation, which they do. I mean, it's remarkable. The state of Iowa, #1 corn state, the recommendations is the same for every field and every year in the state, every soil type, everything. Okay, we can do better than that. So, so some of the work that we did starting maybe about 25 years ago, where we started to look at this temporal or weather-induced variability. So Jason Kahapka, who some of you may know as the Associate Dean of the grad school here, he was a master's student with me. So like in one case, we needed 110 kilograms per hectare, and another year we needed 220, right? I mean, huge differences. This is here at the Musgrave Farm in New York. Ever.Ag, who was a PhD student, started to work with the Leacham model and said, hey, wait a minute, we can kind of, if we incorporate weather information, we can sort of simulate these effects. And that was basically the idea behind Adapt-N, to say, we can make better recommendations by incorporating these factors. So more recently, some work came out of Illinois, where they did a meta-analysis of many site years in the US and Eastern Canada, where they looked at, you know, what's the main source of variability in this economic optimum N rate? And it was basically weather. So especially precipitation, okay? 2/3 of the variability was weather related. So if you don't incorporate weather into your recommendations, you miss a lot of the information that's critical. Soil factors was second, about 10 to 23%. And then they said, well, you need to also account for risk, which of course we had already been working on at that time. But it was nice to see this confirmed, you know, some of the earlier work that we did, and justification for use like a tool of Adapt-N. But most of the recommendations that are being used around the United States, and actually anywhere else in the world almost, are either static or they are what we might call dynamic and adaptive. So static is basically the one that I just illustrated with Iowa State. The official New York recommendations are also static. They're relatively simplistic. They don't account for weather as a source of variability. The other category is the dynamic or adaptive approach. It can be soil testing like a PSNT, can be canopy sensors, or it can be models, which is really what the area that we sort of started to work in. And they each have their pros and cons. The main question, however, is, does it give you a good recommendation? You can have fancy equipment, but if it doesn't give you a good rate, then what's the point, right? So you have to prove that. The other kind of complicating factor is that a lot of these recommendations are based on very simple cropping systems, like corn after corn or corn after soybean, okay? But now we're interested in more diverse type of cropping systems in a sort of multi-objective environment. We care about soil health, about carbon sequestration, about water quality, about energy, about greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're bringing in these more sustainable type cropping systems or regenerative rotations, cover cropping, using more organic inputs. We have higher yielding crop genetics, all of those kind of things. We have better fertilizers, right? So if you just base all your recommendations on these very simple systems, you're missing some of the technological innovations. So that really was the whole point of Adapt-N. So this here shows the Adapt-N as a standalone user interface, the way it was originally offered. So Kevin is going to be showing how this technology is better integrated with other field management systems, because that's what farmers are using. Farmers don't want to use a standalone piece of software. They want it to be part of another piece of software that already has a lot of the data in there, okay? So what are some of these inputs for Adapt-N? And I'm not going to go into details. Some of it is sourced automatically, like climate data, soils data as well. We have our own soil databases. And then there's user inputs on basically soil and crop management practices, right? Fertilizer applications, manure, et cetera. But you'll see that some of these kind of regenerative practices are also included in that: cover cropping, rotations, organic amendments, and all of those kind of things. Very important. And then the model basically discretizes the soil into layers, and then it discretizes in time on a daily basis. So based on daily climate data are the simulations that then generate a recommendation. So just quickly about some of the results. And this is a graph that was actually developed by Jim Sheppers from the ARS after we shared the data with him. And this is based on field validations where we had strips in a field where we had an Adapt-N rate and we had a grower rate, whatever the grower used to apply. And you see on the left side of the graph, those were the situations where Adapt-N recommended less nitrogen than what the grower was using. And you can see that there was virtually no yield loss. On the average, no yield loss. So the savings were with the fertilizer. That was 83% of the cases. In the remaining 70% of the cases, we Adapt-N recommended more than the grower, but it was justified by a yield increase. Okay, so this is kind of the situation that you want. In most cases, you reduce your N rate, but you acknowledge that, especially in wet years, you may actually need a little bit more nitrogen. But overall, you can actually have considerable benefits in terms of profits, both in terms of saving on fertilizer or avoiding yield losses. In terms of the environmental losses, you can simply, by using a more precise recommendations, you can significantly use your environmental losses. So on the left is leaching losses. Any of the dots above the 1-to-1 line meant that there was a reduction in leaching losses from Adapt-N relative to growers, and the same on the right side with the gaseous losses. So 36 to 39% reductions simply by not over-fertilizing, basically, in the vast majority of the cases, without any yield losses. So we also did work with some third parties, notably University of Nebraska has a great on-farm trial network, really fantastic. And so they were interested in testing Adapt-N. And so you can see on the left there that for one of the fields, they had several of the fields. I'm just showing for one field. That Adapt-N recommended a much lower rate than the canopy sensor or what the grower was using, but you can see that the yields are basically the same. So that's a good situation, right? Same yield with less nitrogen. They also did some multi-rate trials where you can determine the economic optimum N rate, and they compared Adapt-N with grower, another commercial product that's now off the market from Corteva, and then the University of Nebraska recommendations. And you can see that Adapt-N did very well in terms of following that one-to-one line, which is really what you want to do. So, so it's been nice to have third parties do some evaluations. Okay, before I hand it over to Kevin, wanted to maybe talk about some of the learnings from doing this, so having a product and integrating it with commercial software. So first, commercialization is critical. Adapt-N would be died on the vine if we didn't license it and partner with a commercial company. Software integration, as Kevin will show, is critical for scaling. If you want farmers to use it, you gotta integrate it with other software systems. And these cloud-based software and solutions have very distinct advantages, especially when it comes to scaling. It's relative. You don't need to buy equipment or anything like that. You can scale it up relatively quickly. So specifically for Adapt-N, Yara, when it was still within Yara, the marketing department did a survey of Adapt-N users, and the number one thing that they really valued was the scientific validity. It does matter to them. There's a lot of stuff out there, very muddied waters, but they like the scientific validity. The customer churn rate is relatively low, so most people that start to use Adapt-N want to keep using it. They don't say, it doesn't work, and they throw it to the side, so that's good. Third-party providers offer additional scaling. So both Yara and now Ever.Ag do work with what are basically competitors and say they will make Adapt-N available to them. So you have that additional scaling. And then, and this my experience is that the public sector really struggles with this kind of technology. They like the old recommendation systems that are very simple. And then you have much more innovative, improved technology. And both within the land-grant university system as well as like state agencies, they don't really know how to deal with that. And so that's a topic for another discussion at some point in time. Anyway, so with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Kevin, who is in Minnesota, and he's going to do a demonstration of the Adapt-N tool within the Fieldalytics field management software system, so within their platform. Okay, Kevin, you can take over. Go ahead and start sharing.
Excellent. Thank you, Harold. Appreciate the time, appreciate the invite to present Fieldalytics and the integration of Adapt-N into Fieldalytics to this group. A little bit the history that I have that I think is important in my role today is I spent 25 years in production agriculture in the retail setting. Started off out of college, have a BS in geography with GIS. Started off with a crop consultant, teaching basically university extension people throughout the United States on how GPS is going to work in tractors, how it's going to work in combines, and how the data is going to be used. So I've been in this game quite a long time. And the thing that I always been working towards is efficiencies. How do we make the tool more efficient so we can get it to more people? And that is one of the drivers on why I left retail and went to Yara with Adapt-N back in April of 2023. My goal is to help them understand retail better, understand the grower at the farm gate better, so we could build a tool that could help with a lot of the issues that Harold talked about. And the thing that really hits home is Harold mentioned the EONR, and we in universities and people who are researching, we understand that nitrogen is finicky, right? But when you try to convince a grower that they need to cut 40 to 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen out of their program, it's a hard sell. They'd rather pay the money for the extra nitrogen to not have the yield loss. So we're working in conjunction trying to help ease some of that pain. And this tool has really opened up a lot of eyes, but we need to get to a lot more. So if there's 96 million acres of corn in the United States, today we're running in about 500,000 acres of that. So we're not even, the tip of the iceberg here on the number of fields and farms that we can touch and help manage nitrogen better. And for the industry, for the environment, for everything, it's the right thing to do. And that's why I'm excited to take this job with Ever.Ag as a product manager, as now I'm helping the developers and our modelers make things more efficient and put into this software. So I'm just going to give you a little rundown of the software. Usually our software demos take 2, sometimes 3 hours, depending on questions. So forgive me, I'm going to condense this into 20 minutes and, do the best I can in that 20 minutes. So basically the software, this is we call it an FMIS, a Farm Management Information System. It's not a true GIS because I can't write scripts in it. I can't do a lot of third-party stuff, but we have grower farms and fields, and this would be what a typical retailer would look like, where they would have different locations, and then they would have, within that location, they would have growers, and then a grower would have farms. And I'm going to just share my little demo farm here that I call KOA Adapt-N. So within that, I have a handful of different farms that I manage that I'm looking at. And if I were a retail agronomist or a grower that had access to this and I wanted to look at my farms, I could come to this dashboard and I could pull up this dashboard and quickly look through what are my nitrogen needs for today. So this RX is giving me a min, average, and max nitrogen need for each of these fields. So I can see this field's calling for 137 pounds of nitrogen today. This field's 98 pounds. This field's 130 pounds. And I can click around and I can open up the map and it'll zoom to the map and I can see what encompasses that recommendation. I can look through, I can click on a cell and it'll tell me what is needed. I can look over here and see that on the right side, I can see a few of the metrics for that field, such as planting date, rainfall since planting. And again, this is current day. So we're looking at all the information set up. I can see I don't have any applications set on this field and I got a little bit left to do. But this is the area that the retail agronomist or the crop consultant will spend. They'll come in here on a daily basis and look, or when it's on schedule to say, I need to see what's going on in these fields, they'll come here to see where that's at. The real power of this tool is having an integration with FieldAlytics is the ability to batch process or do batch things in batch. So I'm going to just come back out here to my grower level, and I'm going to come in here to configure fields on Adapt-N. So the first thing I can do, every field that I have a check mark in, I've already enrolled into the program. So if I have a grower come and say I want to enroll these 3 fields, I can come in here, I can click that, I can hit enroll. What it does then is it starts the process and sends that through the API to the Adapt-N model. It starts building out the soil types, the auto-generated layers that Harold was talking about. Our goal in the future is to make more layers automated. And as I click through some of these layers, you'll get an idea of how we might want to do that. But that's the start of that. And I'm not going to hit enroll because I don't want to enroll any extra acres that are enrolled because it will trigger an invoice. So once I have the fields enrolled, then I can start to configure them. So I can just pick a couple fields here and I can go into configure selected. So now what I'm doing is I have these 2 fields that I have not configured yet. I have them enrolled, but I haven't configured. I can come in and I can do them individually, or I can do them in a batch. So I can say, okay, my expected yield on these fields is 225 bushels. I'm going to have 105-day corn, and I plan to plant somewhere around April 15th. So I can look at it individually. I can come back in after the fact and say, okay, I actually didn't get into this field until April 20th. So now I can just change that. I can also load different yield management zones, so on and so forth. But it's really easy to create a system where you can do multiple fields. And this is, I could go 10 fields, I could go 20 fields, I could do his whole farm at this level. So that's really a powerful thing that we had some of that in the past, but not to this level. So this allows us to batch process and enroll multiple fields at once. For the purpose of showing you some transparency and get more granular with the data, I'm gonna zoom into just one field, and I'm gonna spend most of my time that I have on this one field. So the power of having an integration and using the API to shell out, to adapt and to grab that information, that nitrogen rec, is it allows all of the data to be in one space. So a lot of the issues that I had as a user of Adapt-N when I was back in retail, and a lot of the customer feedback that we get, is that there are times when you don't want to leave a software. I don't want to come in here and take my yield data and export it. I don't want to export my soil tests, because it's all export, import, and you're touching things a lot of times that you won't have to. So if you have this system where everything is sitting, then you can start to configure the field individually. So I can come in here and I can look and say, okay, what's my expected yield? So on this particular field, I'm using a yield potential layer that I created off of a normalized yield map. So I can assign different yield goals to it here, or I can take what the data is in my tree. Then I start to look at population. So this field, they didn't have a variable rate planter, so he just put one flat population in it. I can look at the prior crop. I can change the tillage method, organic matter. So I'm using my most recent soil test point. I can put in an emergence date when that crop came up. This field was planted May 18th, May 18th, and it took a while. We were very wet this spring in southern Minnesota. I can add a cover crop if there was a cover crop to it, so on and so forth. So this screen gives us a lot of versatility. Once all that is entered, it sends the data on its way, and then a rec comes back. And in season, this rec will update daily. But we shut this off around August 15th, August 30th, just because people are not applying nitrogen after that day. So if I look at this particular field, I can see what the setup is. So May 13th was the planting date. I had full emergence on May 28th. I've had 23.4 inches of rain since planting. Estimated growth stage, this stops at VT. So one thing that we're looking for in the future is how do we expand this out into the R stages? And does that make sense, or do we just stop it at VT and that's it? What is the maturity class, prior crop tillage? Then we look at organic matter. So this field has an organic matter range from 1.4 to 13.5. Welcome to Minnesota. This is not abnormal in the region that I work in. So we work a lot with different organic matters, and that's important because it's a mineralization factor that a lot of people don't take into account when they're figuring their nitrogen programs. Then our yield targets. So this is what I want to hit on, why one of the major reasons why the integration with Ever.Ag and Fieldalytics is big for Adapt-N. So here I have a yield target, right? Everybody has a yield goal going into the season, but it's not always attained due to environmental factors that you can't control, as Harold touched on. So if I start this year and I've got a 266 bushel yield goal, which this field has attained that. It's been in the 260s. It's not unreasonable to have that goal to start. But then I start to think about, all right, I didn't plant this field until May 13th. It had kind of a slow emergence. It was cool and wet this spring. So how can I justify changing that rate? Well, there's a couple different ways that we can do it, and it depends on what your agronomy philosophy is. My agronomy philosophy is I'm going to look at historical data to see what did this achieve with similar years. So there's different ways that you can look to see what was similar, what was not. One of the tools that Adapt-N has that we can run in the old user interface is a multi-year comparison. So what this shows us is what were my nitrogen needs for this field the past years that it was corn, because I just wanted to simplify it a little bit. I can go back to 2010 and do every year, but I skipped a few years. And I wanted to look and see, okay, what's similar? So this 2018 seems pretty similar to what 2014 is for loss, recommendation, and rainfall. So then I start to look at my data and say, okay, what happened in 2018 in this field? And I can load up the 2018 yield data, and I can look at this and say, well, I had 170 bushel yield average, and I had quite a few areas here that this spot here was 89 bushels. This spot was 63 bushels. Over here on this little on this little wet hole was 93 bushels. I did obtain some okay yields, 215, 200. So my first thought is I am going to reassign my yield estimates because the 266 bushels is not accurate or realistic. So how do I do that? Well, I could take this past year's yield data, but I don't really want to do that because it's not exactly what's going to happen this year. So I'm going to go back to in-season imagery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to look through my in-season imagery. So imagine with me it's July 15th and the corn's about V18, V16, and I'm going to Y drop it. So what I would do is I would come in and find the most recent image closest to that day. Obviously, if it's July 15th, none of these would be populated yet. So I'll look at this July 12th image. And when that image comes up, it's going to show me the NDVI. So now I can see what is my crop vigor in those spots. And I can tell it. I've got almost crop failure or really poor leaf reflectance in those areas. So I can assume that these are poor yielding areas. I could also go out and scout that. I can send this to the Fieldalytics mobile app. I can look at this image as I go out there and I can verify on foot as well if that's the issue. So I'm going to use this layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new yield potential for it. And I would come into this tool and say create yield potential. And I'm going to call it July 12th yield adjustment. And I have to tell it what commodity I'm on. So corn, field, and bushels per acre. So it's taking these numbers from a database that Ever.Ag has generated off of NASS data based on historic yields. So it's saying in this field, the range is going to be from 178 to 276 on a normal year, on an average year. So I create that, and then I can come in and look at that created layer. Takes just a minute as it rasterizes that data. So now I have this yield estimation layer and I can edit that as well. So because it's going off of averages and I don't feel that I'm above average or at average. So I can do that two different ways. I'm going to take this back to what I feel is appropriate for that season. So now I'm going to go average yield 210 and my range is going to be from 134 to 232. So I can submit that, and now I've got a yield potential layer that I can load into Adapt-N that will change the rec accordingly based on those yield estimates. So I come back into the Adapt-N configuration, and under expected yield, I'm going to unlock that layer, and I'm going to change my expected yield average to 210, and I'm going to use that July 12th yield adjustment number. And it's going to give me values that look like this. And I'm going to say this hole, because I went out and scouted it, is not going to be 143 bushels. I'm going to take that down to 120 bushels. And these areas over here, I also looked at those because I didn't feel that those were, and I'm going to take those to 150. So you can be, it gives the agronomist the opportunity to change things on the fly as they see fit. They might say where the field where it's good is really good, and then you could change that to 245, whatever you felt that number was. So then you save that configuration, and now what it's doing is hitting the API, sending that data to the Adapt-N model, and it takes just a minute because it tells me that my configuration was complete and that Adapt-N accepted the configuration changes. So then it usually takes about 2 minutes for it to come back. So in those 2 minutes, I'll go to another field, I'll look at something else on this, maybe look at some statistics or try and figure out what my next step is with that. Like I said, the calculations, there's quite a few calculations that are being done on it. It's no slower than if we were in the user interface working within the model itself. So just give it a minute. The other things that are really great about being integrated is the transparency. So I can look at my soil tests, I can look at my pHs, and I can make a decision if I want to add pH to the model or not. Some of our users will add it automatically. Others might say, it's pretty neutral. I'm not going to mess around with it. It's just another variable. So, you could look at this and say, okay, in this sand area here, I've got some pretty high pHs. I might want to add my pH to the configuration if I haven't already. So there's different advantages of being in all the data in one. As applied data, so anything that's applied to the field, if the controller is hooked up to Fieldalytics, then the data will come back into the software. So we have access to everything in one spot. And again, so you can see part of it is back because the yield has changed to 217 because I changed that high level to 245, but the rec still is on its way. But we can use what we have, and I can come back to that. So the user then would then the next step would be to pull up the PDF off of the field. And what this tells us is what's going on in this field. What is happening that would make that recommendation 91 pounds? And so you can see the range of total and loss. So we can look throughout the season on what our losses are from the min and the max and the average. Then I can break that down into a gas loss or a leaching loss. So I didn't have a lot of gas loss this year. Most of my loss came from the leaching state, which is normal to the amount of moisture we had. So here I'm looking at the field capacity of moisture, and you can see how the up and down throughout the season. And we were wet most of the year up until probably early July. Then it dried out and we finally got back into the fields. There probably wasn't a wheel turn spraying or side dressing in southern Minnesota from June 10th to July 4th. Just that much rain. So here's the different graphs that we look at, so the grower and the agronomist can see what's happening to this field. Why are we getting that? If we have fall application of ammonia, then we look at, okay, what's mineralizing? Where are we getting some winter losses? Are we getting was it warm here? So we can see this is not normal for Minnesota in this February, March timeframe to have averages of 50 degrees consistently. Usually it's down here. We only have this one cold spell January, February this year. So for winter lovers, it was kind of a dismal winter, but for people that like the warmth, it was nice. We can break it out lost by different soil structure. So sand, leaching. So this field, the two red spots in the field were sand. So we are losing a lot of nitrogen on that sand. So what do? We talk to this grower the next year and say, maybe we pull the anhydrous bar up as we go across those spots. Maybe it's not worth it to put that nitrogen down in those areas, and we treat it differently, or we go to a all spring urea application variable rate and just start with a lower rate at that point. So those are all the metrics that we look at when we're trying to define what the rec will look like. So now that other rec is back, so I can look to see now how the rec is adjusted by changing that nitrogen, that yield goal. So we're going to go from a 95 pound rate to a 40 pound rate. So now we're looking at a new recommendation based on this lower yield goal, which is more realistic to what the season is. So this is where the user would go out and take this to the field to apply. And you can see how much time do I have left, Harold?
We're just about out of time. Yes.
Okay, so I just want to do one more thing here. So the main thing about this is a tool that's in this tool set that's really powerful is I'm going to pick this field. So I'm going to get ready to take this to the field to spread. And what I can do is I can come in here and select this Adapt-N only rec. And I have a product built in here called just straight nitrogen. So I just call it Adapt-N nitrogen need. And what I do is I run this and I do a flat rate comparison. So if you remember, this field was calling for 40 pounds of N. So I'm going to submit this. And this is where you would send the product to the machine. It sends direct. If your machine or asset is connected, we can send it right to the machine out in the field. We don't have to do jump drives and stuff like that we had to do in the old user interface. But what this is showing is the red areas are being under applied and the green areas are being over applied, or vice versa. So in this 50 pound application rate that we're going to put on this field, some areas are getting 135 pounds and some areas should get a lot less than that. And so what it does is it shows the farmer that if I went out with that 50 pound rate, or if I went out with that 50 pound rate, some areas I would be under applying by 110 pounds and other areas I would over apply by 40 pounds. So by doing a flat rate application, you're not putting the right product in the right place. And that's the main point of the 4 R's is if I were to recommend, if this person absolutely did not want to do variable rate and they wanted to maximize yield on this field, the recommendation to that grower would be you need to be somewhere in that 120 to 150 pound range across the field, because you want to maximize the yield at the highest level. So it's really unfortunate that people are looking at what they can do and not utilizing the tools that are out there with the GPS and the variable rate application. And it's getting more and more. I mean, things are coming online faster than ever, and I'm looking forward to where, the next 10 years are going to go with all this technology and automation and AI evaluations of fields and data. So maybe you don't have to go out and boot check it, or you can use data imagery more quickly and have more images available. So again, yeah, appreciate the time. I get excited when I think about all the opportunities that users have now today with Adapt-In, and just appreciate Cornell and Harold, coming up with the tool, and hopefully we can continue the relationship to continue to make it better. And one other thing, the university validity is a big deal. Farmers want that check. They want that I know what I'm doing is right, and I'm not going to lose yield.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. I hope that gave you a little bit of a taste of the benefits that we have from integration with other software and innovations that are happening on that end, and how we basically can partner with them. Janice, you have a question?
At the 10th celebration of SIP's school, I hope you were there for Doug Gross's presentation.
I wasn't, no.
Okay, where he heralded, unintended, Adapt-In on one of his slides as a positive outcome of the school. But yeah, so congratulations.
That's nice to know.
That was kind of front and center in his presentation, which I was really delighted to see. So there was a little bit of kerfuffle in the back when supply capacity of the soil was discussed, and I just want to understand this aspect of it a little bit better. I mean, and mineralization is, of course, going to be affected by your climate and all the rest. So are you starting from a position of having a soil health measurement on soil protein, for example, and then working that into the model, or how is the supplying the capacity of the soil itself being put into these calculations and account?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So we basically have kind of two pools that we're working with. So one is the soil organic matter pool and the mineralization of soil organic matter, and we're basing that currently on basically on organic matter and texture. So we're not using any of the soil health indicators. That's something that I'd like to do, but it's not that widely measured. So organic matter is standard soil testing. The other pool is the more labile pool that is associated with sort of these more recent additions. So like a cover crop. Kevin didn't have time to really talk about that, but we worked, and Matt Ryan actually contributed. Matt was here, right? Yeah. Helped and Steve Mirsky as well had some good data on cover crop nitrogen contributions, or some of my earlier work at the Willsboro farm on alfalfa contributions. So those are kind of seen as more labile pools, and then we had the soil organic matter pool. So it's you have to make shortcuts, right? You have to focus on what really matters. And so yeah, so that's basically manure. Of course, is a big issue, and being here in New York, we put a lot of effort into the manure component. And it's interesting because here in New York, especially the consultants, so ACS, which is the big crop consulting company, their headquarters right here by the airport on Warren Road, they're developing new software that focuses a little bit more on the dairy industry. And so they're going to be one of the users of Adapt-In through their own ecosystem, through their own platform, basically. So, but the manure issue is any of these organic inputs, as you know, are much tougher to deal with than sort of like a straight, urea or liquid solution or anything like that. So I think we can take a little bit of pride on that component, at least, that I think we've done a fairly good job. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Requirements across the U.S. So guide and
No, not that I'm aware of. We did work with Environmental Defense Fund a few years ago on the issue of a benchmark, the N-balance benchmark, and to see how that sort of related to actual recommendations, and whether you'd be able to meet a certain criteria, certain N-balance benchmarks. that's about the extent of it. It's been, one of the reasons why we decided to go and license it is because it was very difficult to work with other universities. So when you do an innovation, you're to some extent disrupting. I mean, I don't like the term disrupting because it's kind of overused, but within the US, we have a land-grant university system, and every state has their own land-grant university and has their own nutrient recommendations. And we only have that with nutrient recommendations. We don't have it with tillage or cover crop recommendations, but nutrients, every state has their own recommendation system. And so our system was much more universal. And so it was difficult working with the specialists in each of the land-grant university. And so we said, okay, let's just go the commercial route. And I'm really, really glad we did, because you can see the result that if you work with the commercial sector, you can really innovate and keep innovating,
And there are academic licenses, like if I wanted to, this is the benchmark, but I'll do that. Is there any law like that? So
we need to talk to the company. The company has an exclusive license, so they can sub-license, but Cornell cannot sub-license to someone else. But yeah, we've always worked with other organizations like University of Nebraska, Auburn University, NC State University. So the company is very open to collaborations. We always are careful that because sometimes you have collaborators who don't use the tool properly, and then they say, oh, it doesn't work. It's like, no, you didn't use it properly. But yeah, in general, they're very open to that. Yeah. Yeah, Bruce.
Yes, hi. Thank you for presenting this topic. I have several questions. What's the user attribute of this platform? Kevin demonstrated something. I was watching so complex or complicated with the farming perspective. You're very busy. You do a lot of things. Okay. How do you get the attention of the app? Is there any legal mass, consultants, they help them and do the stuff before they can use solely that end of that.
I would say that the vast majority of the users are these consultants, these people, these agronomists, and they could work either with, say a co-op. They could be a private consultant. Sometimes they work with a larger company. Maybe Kevin, you can chime in a little bit on that. But I would say it's now fairly rare that it's an individual farmer, although it may be a larger farm that employs their own agronomist. It's basically, it probably looked a lot more complicated than it is. There's not that steep of a learning curve. But you always have to strike a balance between, people want a certain level of sophistication because they want good recommendations. But if you have a data-driven tool, it does require, some skills to be able to, to use it effectively. So, Kevin, do you have any? Did you hear that question?
Yeah, I heard a little bit of it. It was breaking up, but I think the gist of it was, I would say 98% of the acres that are run through Adapt-N today are done through a retail agronomist or a crop consultant type of business. And the reason is that farmers want that. They request that second opinion. Just like doing their taxes. A lot of farmers aren't going to prepare their own tax returns. Just because there's so much detail, and nitrogen is the same way. A farmer wants another set of eyes, and they want proof and data to know that they're doing the right thing. Farmers want to be environmentally sensitive. They really do, but they also have to do it at a cost. And so how do we marry both of those together? But I would say the majority of our users are crop consultant or retail agronomists.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.